Welcome to the Nightly 5 podcast with Belle Taylor.
On today's show, an Aussie mother has faced court in Taiwan after being arrested with 7 kilos of drugs in her suitcase. Australia's media regulator is taking legal action against telecommunications giant Optus over a major cyber attack in 2022. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a general election for July 4, giving British voters a choice between his government and the Keir Starmer-led Labor Party. A new royal portrait has once again turned everyone into an art critic. This time, a new painting of the Princess of Wales has everyone asking, who is that? And George R.R. Martin has announced that Game of Thrones spin-off series The Hedge Knight is moving along nicely, which is all very well, but fans are still upset. We'll tell you why. In our top story today, an Aussie mum faces a Taiwanese court on drug smuggling charges.
You're listening to the Nightly 5.
An Australian mother of 5 is facing the death penalty after being arrested at a Taiwan airport with 7 kilos of drugs in her suitcase. 57-year-old Debbie Vulgaris appeared in a Taipei court on Thursday. Her lawyer, Leon Huang, told the court his client's ex-husband, John, was responsible for the drugs. He said that Ms. Vulgaris had no idea they were concealed inside a hidden compartment in her luggage. Mr. Huang also said Ms. Vulgaris was unaware of the nature of her travel. He said that it was essential that John take the stand to clear her name and that his team was preparing a subpoena to force him to face court. Taiwan police allege Ms. Vulgaris was paid $2,700 to transport the drugs, with her travel costs also included. The punishment for drug smuggling in Taiwan can range from 5 years in prison to the death penalty. Ms. Vulgaris will next face court in August.
Optus is in major damage control this afternoon after hackers accessed the personal details of up to 9 million current and past customers. The stolen information includes phone numbers, driver's licences and passport numbers. Banks have been notified and Australia's spy agencies called in to help the telco.
Yes, it's one phone call that Optus did not want to receive. The telecommunication giant is being taken to court by Australia's media regulator over a major cyber attack almost 2 years ago. In September 2022, Optus was hit with a massive data breach that exposed the personal information of millions of customers. Names, dates of birth, phone numbers and email addresses were all exposed by the hackers. Some customers also had their addresses, ID document numbers such as driver's licence numbers or passport numbers exposed. The Australian Communications and Media Authority has filed proceedings in the federal court, alleging that during the data breach, which occurred between September 17 to 20, 2022, Optus failed to protect the confidentiality of its customers' personal information.
My name is Hannah Uzo and I'm an artist. So I've been commissioned to do a painting by Tatler magazine. It's really important to capture the soul of the person. So I spent a lot of time looking at her pictures, watching videos of her, seeing her with her family, seeing her in diplomatic visits, seeing her when she's rowing or visiting children in a hospice. It's been really interesting for me to get a sense of who she is.
Another day, another royal portrait. A painting of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has been revealed on the cover of UK's Tatler magazine. It was painted by British Zambian artist Hannah Uzo, and reaction has been mixed. If you haven't seen it, jump online and take a look. It comes on the back of a few portraits that have been in the media lately. There's been the painting of King Charles by Jonathan Yao, which saw the monarch covered in red, and controversially, a portrait of mining giant Gina Rinehart by Vincent Namatjira. Joining me today is artist and member of the WA Portrait Artists Association, Peter Semitis. Peter, John Singer Sargent said, "Every time I paint a portrait, I lose a friend." How true is that?
Absolutely. In fact, I delivered a speech only about a month ago with that exact title in it. When painting a portrait, as compared to photographing a portrait, I think great portraiture is always about interpretation. So it's about the artist's own take. It's about their own spin, their own interpretation of the individual in whatever way they're going to do it, whatever style.
Because one criticism, so the layman's criticism, especially of royal portraiture, is people say, oh, it doesn't look anything like them. Is that sort of missing the point?
I think it is to a degree. I think also because we're coming from a background where we're so used to seeing very conservative, very conventional royal portraits, that the focus was on a faithful reproduction of likeness. It was about emphasising their importance, but it wasn't about exploring what they might be about as people, as individuals. And I think some of the ones we're seeing now are actually starting to delve into that space. It's starting to ask questions about what is it about the man, King Charles? What is it about the woman, Kate Middleton, that starts becoming an interesting take?
So, Peter, as you said, we've moved away from that sort of really realistic portraiture. But all three of these portraits that I just mentioned in the intro there are so dramatically different in style. Are portrait artists always a little bit doomed when it comes to revealing their portraits of people? Because are people always going to be saying, well, that's not how I see that person? You know, you're saying that's how the artist sees that person. So are they always going to have a bit of, well, I don't see the person that way?
I think you're exactly right. And that goes back to that quote you had about losing a friend. The minute you reveal a portrait that actually starts exploring a little bit about the subject, maybe that's something that the subject may not want to delve into a great deal. So, that does actually, play a big part. I think another interesting thing is that we're seeing, you spoke about the diversity of styles or diversity of approaches. And I think what we're seeing here is, if we're comparing it to music, the portrait of King Charles, it's still in that vein of being highly accomplished, highly representational, although he sort of does, actually wash back the regalia so that, in fact, he puts more focus on the man rather than the position. But there's an accomplishment and a detail and precision in how he produces that. So it's kind of like a really well-oiled band or group that really knows its stuff and is so tight, etc. Some of the other artists, a bit more more like a punk outfit. It's not about actually being absolutely fabulous musicians. It's about actually the energy and the spirit and
capturing someone's essence.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So I'll often have a look at works in that sort of light as well. What sort of work background do they come from?
It's interesting that royal portraiture is always so hotly debated, because the royals really occupy this very exalted place in our society. But it's a place that is endlessly debated these days. We used to have the portraits of the Queen, and they were very, as you said, very straight, very photorealistic. She was always in her regalia. And now royal portraiture artists seem to want to really question not only the person they're painting, but their position in society. Do you think we're going to see more and more almost politicised portraiture of these sort of figures?
I think in terms of formal royal portraiture, possibly not, because one does have to remember that, for example, these were commissioned portraits. They weren't portraits by an artist who was imparting their spin on the subject. So it is always with the blessing of the subject. Perhaps it talks a lot about the willingness or the courage of royal subjects to actually allow themselves to be painted in particular ways. And that's been the case in the history of art. Pretty much most of the Renaissance portraits you see, every one of them was paid for by somebody. They weren't interpretive works.
Do you think the royals are a bit like, I don't need another picture of me, just looking in my uniform, I want something wild? Like the Queen, there was a photo of the Queen where she was just sort of a floating head at one point, right? Like there's been some pretty out there royal portraits.
I think we're definitely moving that way. And I think that there's been that willingness to experiment, and also willingness to perhaps show that the royals are moving with the times. They are actually now recognising they're part of the 21st century and starting to reflect, their own visage in that sort of way.
Yeah. When you go to sit down to paint a portrait, what's your first approach? Do you always like to get the subject in, or do you do it from photos? How do you approach a portrait?
When I paint, it will be always, or whenever I can, it will be meeting the subject, spending a little bit of time with them, getting a sense of their character and personality, because that's the stuff you want to try to draw out in some sort of way. Look, I'm a slow painter, so when I do a portrait, I will spend time sitting with them initially, certainly taking a lot of photographs, some sketching, etc. But then often the work itself might take weeks or months to develop in the studio. So that's when you keep coming back to some of the photographs that you took to check the likenesses and elements like that. But also then I kind of take myself back a little bit and look at it, almost like a bit of jazz. Does it feel like it needs, a flourish here or a note there or something like that? So you have to let it kind of flow into you a bit as well.
You said before that you've seen the portrait of Catherine, Princess of Wales, earlier today. What was your initial reaction to that?
It was interesting. The work, I think, was speaking a lot to her, a sense of frailty, and perhaps even a diminished sense of importance. It was not a work that starts saying, it's not in that tradition of saying, this is a powerful person, this person should be exalted, etc. Again, I think Hannah might have been starting to explore what it is to be a human in that royal role, and perhaps also a human going through what Kate Middleton's going through at the moment as well. And that's maybe that part of the documentation of, the frailty.
Yeah. People have really strong responses to portraiture. So it was really interesting to see a new one coming out there. And having looked at some of your own work and some of the work coming out of Australian portraiture artists, it's such a rich and interesting world to dive into. We've obviously got the Archibald Prize that's so popular, and I'm sure we'll be looking at a lot of those later this year. Thank you so much for joining me today, Peter.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
Britain will go to the polls in July after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called a snap general election.
Britain is heading to the polls. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a general election for July 4, ending months of speculation as to when he would call a new vote. Sunak stood outside his Downing Street office in pouring rain and announced he was calling the election earlier than expected. It's a risky strategy, with his party, which has been in power for 14 years, far behind Labor in the opinion polls. The Prime Minister had to almost shout to be heard as he announced the news. Protesters just outside the Downing Street gates were blaring the song "Things Can Only Get Better," a track associated with the Labor Party. During the announcement, Sunak listed what he said were his achievements in government, not only as Prime Minister but also as former Finance Minister. He told media voters face a choice between stability with him and the Conservative government and the unknown with Labor leader Keir Starmer. Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin has posted on his personal blog that his new TV series is moving along nicely. Called The Hedge Knight, the show is based in Westeros, but it is set 100 years before the events of Game of Thrones. So you may think fans of Martin would be pleased at this news. Well, they are absolutely not, apparently. Joining us to explain why they are so upset is the Nightly's culture editor, Wenli Ma. Wenli, what exactly is the problem?
Well, I think longtime fans of Game of Thrones are getting pretty impatient at George R.R. Martin's lack of delivery of the sixth book, The Winds of Winter. That book was meant to come out in 2016. It was meant to come out before the sixth season of the HBO original series, Game of Thrones. And now it's 8 years later and there is no sign of it. Instead, George R.R. Martin, we don't begrudge him his success and wanting to do some different things, but he's been busy, doing all these other sorts of Game of Thrones related things, but not the actual book.
It sounds like you may begrudge it just a little. In your article on thenightly.com.au, I like that you've speculated on the level of procrastination that George R.R. Martin has reached. You say on a basic level, there are 3 levels of procrastination. The first is just avoiding the work, mooching on the couch. The second is when you busy yourself doing other productive tasks like housework or, in this case, a TV show. And the third is when you continue to research or prep instead of starting the actual work. Wenli, this sounds like a paragraph you've written straight from the heart. And you have said that Martin seems to be stuck in the middle rung of procrastination there. That's your theory and you're sticking with it?
That's my theory. That paragraph is from a counsellor who told me this is what my levels of procrastination were when I was at university and very, very late handing some assignments in. And she explained to me the different levels of procrastination. At that point, I was on the third level where it's like, you just keep researching when really you should just start writing. I'm like, yeah, I know, but what I really want to do is go watch TV. So now I just think this is where George R.R. Martin is, that he's like, I'm being productive. I'm doing all these other things for Game of Thrones fans, like this new series, like all the fan conventions that he does. But really, I think fans are like, where's the sixth book, George? And then where is the seventh book? Because controversially, the Game of Thrones series actually ended in a way that many fans were not happy about. And they're kind of hoping that when the books come out, which I think are expected to diverge a little bit from where the TV show went, it will be a bit of a do-over, which will be very pleasing for the fans who actually demanded that the TV people make a new 8th season.
Do you think that Martin is perhaps just a little bored with the Game of Thrones characters?
I mean, maybe he's bored with the main ones. I wouldn't think so, because he's still promising that the next book is going to be like 1,500 pages.
Yeah. And let's face it, there are a lot of characters in
a
the
lot
show.
of characters, exactly. If you're bored of Sansa, pick up someone else, see where Arya is going.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different chess pieces he can play with. I just think, actually, I don't know. I would love to know what it is that's holding George back from finishing the book.
Perhaps he's literally the only person in the world who was really happy with the way the TV series ended, and he was like, oh, well, look, they've done it. Don't have to worry about that anymore.
Not even the TV creators then in that theory.
Well, maybe. Well, look, fingers crossed. And hey, in the meantime, we've got the Hedge Knight, which sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, it sounds really fun. It's based on the Duncan Egg stories, which is a 3-part sort of novella that he published between 1998 and 2010. It is about, it's set 100 years before Game of Thrones, 72 years after House of the Dragon, and it's about a young dashing knight and his squire and the adventures they have. And Martin promised that if it does really well, he will then adapt the next 2 books in the series as well. And even before that happens, House of the Dragon is back for its 2nd season next month.
Oh, there's a lot of Westeros to go around, basically, isn't there?
Very, very much so. So lots of things to tie everyone over until the Winds of Winter comes, if it ever comes.
If it ever does. And then we can procrastinate from our own life tasks by reading it.
Precisely. Productive.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for joining me today, Winley.
Thank you.
And that is today's show. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join Ben on the Nightly 5 tomorrow.
The Nightly 5 podcast is brought to you by 7 West Media. For all these stories and more, head to thenightly.com.au, helping you get in front of tomorrow.